works well and the central bank is credible, the spreads are very, very small. And indeed, this was the case as well in the case of the euro area. I mean, Francisco, you were there, right? So when we had the good years before the global financial crisis. But then something happened. Something happened. And since the global financial crisis, we are effectively perpetually in crisis. So what I want to ask is the question, well, what determines spread? So it's, when I go around the Euro system talking to former colleagues, economists and so forth, I ask the question, what is the fundamental spread for this country, for the other country, and so forth? And it's very difficult to get an answer. What is important for our purposes is to realize that spreads reflect economic fundamentals, but also, importantly, the framework of the central bank. So it's not simple to say, well, spreads reflect markets, and we just take the markets as given. What we observe in markets reflects the market perceptions about how the central bank will implement its own policy, and effectively different plumbing gives you different outcomes in these things. So the collateral framework is one of the important determinants of spreads, and this is one of the key distinctions of the ECB and other central banks. Other central banks in the world try very hard, and most of the time they're quite successful, to protect the liquidity of government bonds, because this is a valuable asset for the economy. And the ECB is an exception in that it relies on credit ratings just to determine the collateral eligibility of government debt. And this creates a vulnerability just unique to the euro area. This is the use of the discretionary authority of the governing council of the ECB. And the problem with this is that because we're talking about government bond markets, what the ECB is doing actually can create multiple equilibria and can actually guide some countries to adverse self-fulfilling equilibria that actually would be consistent with what we observe in crisis. In particular, what is really nasty about what the ECB is doing is that it effectively, not mechanically, there is always some uncertainty about this, it effectively delegates to credit rating agencies whether government debt should be eligible collateral or not. This creates a cliff effect where you say investors have to guess, are we close to the case where another downgrade is going to actually push this country to sink, I guess, to the Mediterranean if you're south, to the Baltic Sea, if you're north, it depends on the location. And then, the ECB is no longer your central bank, because effectively this is the equivalent of what happens. So the way to think about it in terms of a model, Ivan Lengwiller, who's at the University of Basel, and I wrote down a very, very simple model to examine how the cliff effect works. You can think about the haircut on collateral. If you have zero haircut on collateral, that means the bank can bring you a bond valued at 100, you have liquidity at 100. If the haircut is 100, the bank brings you a bond valued at 100, and you say, sorry, I don't accept this bond, the haircut is 100%. So this gives you the cliff effect that you have on this chart. The way we model it in the paper is to say, think about it as a threshold on the debt to GDP ratio. This is the economic equivalent that we have for the credit rating role. The credit ratings are correlated to debt to GDP. It's very easy to show that if you have a cliff structure on your collateral framework, then without any uncertainty, with the same economic fundamentals, you actually have multiple equilibria. You can have same economy, can be at low interest rates, low debt, or high interest rates, high in debt. In one case, the ECB accepts the collateral as eligible and actually protects it. In the other one, it doesn't. And this is the problem you have even with no uncertainty. If you add uncertainty to this, then of course you can easily create situations where just the design of the collateral framework can cause unnecessary defaults that would not have otherwise occurred if the collateral framework was more reasonable. Why is that? Because the collateral framework determines what the cost of funding is for government debt, and anything that raises the cost of funding for government debt makes a government more vulnerable to default. So how important is this in practice? It's not easy to tell. I mean, we don't have many models of this. We don't have models with a discontinuity in the collateral framework. It's for good reason. It's kind of the ECB is the only central bank that is doing this, so there wasn't that much demand on the other side. But the ECB gave us a very nice experiment, a case study during the pandemic. As we know, during the pandemic, there was a lot of needs. Debt to GDP ratios increased by 20, 30 percentage points. That would have created a lot of tension, and indeed it did. And the ECB had to actually adapt to this framework to avoid a problem. So I just want to use this as an example, a chart with Italian debt to GDP ratio from October 2019 and October 2020 on the left-hand side. Now, this is the sort of thing, it happened in 2020, that had this thing happened to Italy in 2013, in 2014, then the prediction in markets would have been that Italy would have been the next country to sink in the Mediterranean. This is pretty much what would have happened with the collateral framework. What I want you to see on the right-hand side, these are daily spreads for Italy. And you can see how terrible, of course, we were all living through that. March was quite a deal. We had the 12th March episode with a mishap communication. Spreads actually became very high. The ECB intervened by starting to purchase debt. And I want you to see after the PEP, when the ECB started purchasing debt, that stabilized markets just for a week or so. It was not enough. But luckily for the euro area, on the 22nd of April, the ECB suspended its reliance on credit ratings, and that actually calmed the markets. And this is how we managed to avoid the problem. So this is the decision. It was effectively a temporary suspension of the framework on April 20th. It was temporary until September 21. Then it was extended in December 2020 to be effective until June 2022. All of this were going fine, except why did we have a hot summer last year? Well, unfortunately, the ECB Governing Council on March 24 of last year decided to return to the pre-pandemic collateral framework, phasing it in. And this is going to be completed in March of 2024. So unless the ECB completes the review and improves the framework, we already have some tensions, and we can expect more tensions ahead. This was the decision on March 2022. You can see, again, this is phasing in into March 2024. And of course, as you would have expected, this created tensions in markets. And this is a chart that just summarizes what those tensions are. The spreads between the green, the vertical green and vertical red lines is the period where the ECB had effectively temporarily suspended the framework, and you can see spreads are lower. But it was never a complete suspension. There was always the uncertainty about what would happen next. If the ECB had totally given up on the credit ratings for government debt, those spreads would have actually collapsed, which would have been an even better outcome. And of course, right now we do not have the same stability, so we are back to the spread situation where we were before. So that's the question we started with. What role for credit ratings in the new normal for government debt? Well, none really. There is no theoretical justification that can be defended for this being good central banking. So in my view, the work in progress that the ECB president mentioned at the monetary dialogue should lead to a better framework. In my view, the ECB should embrace the lessons from its success during the pandemic and simply stop using credit ratings for government debt. Thank you.
Thank you. Before we move on, I would like you to put this in context for us if you can. So hang on to your microphone. Specifically, can you tell us if we should be thinking about collateral solely in the sense of banks using their lender of last resort, also for monetary policy operations, and then what about non-government debt collateral?
Yeah, so this is what I'm describing here, and this is what makes the ECB really unique. This is bread and butter monetary policy operations. This is why this is so strange that for the implementation of monetary policy, this is what we would call open market operations. There would be a reliance on credit. It's very different for if you're talking about emergency lending, emergency liquidity assistance, then that opens up a number of other things. Other central banks are using credit ratings for other assets, never for government debt. When it comes to emergency lending assistance, so that's actually quite common. The crucial distinction is that government debt is such a special asset in an advanced economy that makes it very important for the central bank to treat it correctly and not create any problems. Again, every other central bank in every other advanced economy is very careful with it. And the ECB started being extremely careful with this as well. I had shown you the spreads early on. The original framework that the ECB started with was adopted December of 1998, I believe. Was quite reasonable. But look, we messed up. When I was there in 2010, we messed up. And the issue is, if we recognize that we messed up, it would be useful to help the institution improve its framework so that we can be in a better place going forward.
That's very helpful. Francesco, you have some thoughts.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. I would like my slides to be put on. And of course, I mean, the first thing to say is that many thanks for inviting me to this meeting. And in this meeting, I would like to do 4 things, but I'm afraid I will only able to do 2 because Rebecca will stop me in the track if I go on for too long. So can I have the slides on? Okay, so these are the 4 things that I would like to do. On which part of the analysis of Fanidis and his co-author I agree. On which parts I disagree and why. My practical conclusion about the ECB collateral framework and some minor points with a different reading of the ECB actions and statements. As I said, I may be stopped after point 2, but I have something to say about point 3 and 4 as well. So I agree on 2 important points in the paper. The first important point on which I agree is that you cannot use the small country assumption for the ECB. The small country assumption says that a country can think of global equilibrium in the world as being unaffected by its actions. Now, the ECB is much too an important actor to take this assumption. It does change the equilibrium in the market with its own action. A corollary of that is for collateral management. Collateral management is an important component of monetary policy. It does affect equilibrium. It does affect the ability of the market to discriminate between different sovereigns. It affects the central bank, the risk that the central bank takes on its operation. But I would not want to exaggerate the importance of the collateral framework. Just to think of the difference between temporary operations, which is what you use collateral framework for, and outright operations, which is QE and so on and so forth. And the effect is much stronger on outright than on temporary. And we know that we should not even exaggerate the importance of outright operations. QE works, but it's limited effectiveness. My agreement ends here. And I've gone through the model that Athanasios and his co-author put forward to try to understand what generated these very important effects. I mean, Athanasios wrote that the ECB established the basis for the crisis with its collateral framework. So that was not at all my understanding. So I tried to understand what is it that in the model produces these dramatic effects. And I identified the two important features of the model. The first one is banks post government bonds first for their liquidity needs, while non-government assets are only posted when no more bonds are available. So banks rely mostly on government bonds for their liquidity. And then the other essential component, and Athanasios referred to that, if the haircut grows up to 100%, banks suffer an important liquidity shock. The yield on government bond increases significantly, aggravating debt sustainability, creating the risk of default, and in this model, they create all sorts of negative consequences. So, in essence, an increase in the haircut is an important shock for banks, and banks translate this important shock onto the market for government bonds, and this has all sorts of negative effects, even real effects. Now, I see the model as an ingenious model to dramatize the effect of collateral, to make a small thing big. Yeah, I mean, it's very, if you look at the paper, it's very ingenious. It's just based on wrong assumptions. The conclusion that the ECB inadvertently planted the seeds of the euro crisis is a vast exaggeration of reality. And as I say, I think this is based on two assumptions which are wrong, empirically wrong. The two empirically wrong assumptions are banks depend mostly on government bonds to satisfy their liquidity needs. For instance, to redeem withdrawn deposit. You have a little equation there. The liquidity that banks get depends on how many bonds they have and on the haircut. And the other important assumption is that banks are the only purchasers of government bond. So government expenses, G, depends on how many bonds banks have bought. Now, showing that these two assumptions are wrong is easy, I would say elementary. This is taken from the ECB website. What is important is the blue thing down there. The blue thing down there is the usage of government bond as collateral. Tiny. 10 to 20% maximum. 80 to 90% of collateral is non-government bonds. And it's odd if you think of the financial system, because government bonds are about 50% of the eligible collateral. But banks just don't use it for collateral because they've got better use for it in the private sector. And what you have used with ECB are things, assets, that is very difficult to use in the private sector. Bank loans, the biggest asset-backed securities, which are tiny in the eligible asset database, but are very important in the usage. And then cover bonds. These are the three most used assets. So the assumption that banks mostly use government bonds is just wrong. It's not there. 80%, 90% is non-government paper. This is trying to explain why this is the case. Here you have theoretical liquidity level in a matrix. So you have different assets, sovereign and non-sovereign, and you have different counterparties, the ECB and the market. Now, sovereign paper is more liquid than non-sovereign paper in absolute terms. But if you look at the counterparty, because the liquidity depends on the counterparty, you find that non-sovereign paper used with the ECB is much more liquid than non-sovereign paper used with the market. And the opposite is true for sovereign paper. So banks just don't find it useful to use very precious government bonds with the ECB, because ECB is very generous in its collateral framework. It will accept whatever they can bring along. So liquidity is intrinsic to the counterparty. It's not intrinsic to the asset. It's a bit like a comparative advantage in international trade. Now. When it comes to the banks being the sole purchaser of government bonds, now you have here a chart that tells you what is the share of government bonds owned by banks. Something like 20%. Even in the case of Italy, it's about 25%. So 75 to 80% of bonds are not bought by banks, but by other counterparties. So my conclusion here is that the shock that comes from increases in the haircut up to 100%, up to ineligibility, is small for banks, because banks don't use government bonds a lot for their liquidity, and banks are small players in the market for government bonds. So these two parameters, which are critical to reach this explosion of effect, are just wrong. Sorry. Let me come, if I may, to practical conclusion. If I have another few minutes, Rebecca. Okay.
We have a lot to discuss and not so much time, so let's keep it moving.
I do have 8 practical conclusions. My first practical conclusion, which just repeated the story about the ECB not being a small country, is the ECB has a basic problem about its risk management, because many or most of the techniques of risk management are based on the assumption that the equilibrium in the market is not disturbed by the actor. And this is justified for a private company. Even the biggest bank, you would think, can assume that it will not change equilibrium in the market because of its action. This does not apply to the ECB. This is a big problem that applies to the entire risk management of the ECB. My second practical point is that the paper says just nothing about rating agencies. There is nothing in the paper which is specific to rating agencies. The conclusion of the paper...
We need to speed through these, because I can see how your points, since you're saying it doesn't talk, is that the only possible approach is that the ECB would accept government paper in all conditions, which I think is something we can debate and I have a question about. So perhaps you could go to your next slide and then we can let Peter have a turn.
Okay. Do I explain these other ones, or?
You say we can use other ways to look at credit quality, and you need a solution, not just to stress the weakness of the current system. Thank you. Which are good points.
Okay. Well, I don't think that it would be a good solution, which would be the only solution which is consistent with the analysis of Athanasios. That the ECB would say, in all circumstances, I would always accept government bonds as collateral. This is legally impossible because the statute says that the ECB cannot give a favorable treatment to government paper. So it's legally, and I think it's economically wrong, because I don't think it's the purpose or the task of the ECB to discipline governments but it's not the task of the ECB either to kill any ability of the market to distinguish between issuers of government securities.
So you say, if I may summarize your slides, you think the current one is bad except for all the others. And I would like you to discuss a little bit this point number 8, which is about Greece. Because on the one hand, you're saying the ECB is following the FSB Basel suggestion to avoid situations that could lead to big changes abruptly, and you mentioned what the ECB did. On the other hand, Greece, which defaulted at a certain point, is exactly why people want to keep the current framework. So the ECB didn't do it because at a certain point, Greece did default. So talk about that.
Well, I think point 8 is about doing what you have. Yes, there is this rating system, but you want to apply in a non-mechanistic way. And then non-mechanistic derives from 3 features. The first one is that the ECB uses the best of 3 ratings. So there is a graduation. Before you get to the last one, you know that something is happening. Second, the ECB did something for Greece, especially in 2010 and 2020, and it substituted its own judgment to the rating agencies. And third, again for Greece, it allowed the use of ELA, government paper in ELA, for very large amounts, 100 billion, that for Greece is a very large amount.
When it withdrew that was what triggered what eventually happened with the write-downs.
So yeah, I think it's a way to use that system, which is as bad as you can think, but better than anyone else, in a pragmatic way. So I'm not saying that what Madame Lagarde said about the rethinking is wrong. Yes, rethink. I don't find a better system, but of course if a better system is found, but not a system that says in all circumstances, whatever happens, we will always accept government securities as collateral.
Thank you. Thank you both for setting up the sides of this. You have done an excellent job of laying out this without touching the politics, which is the reason why we have the system. The euro area and the design of the ECB is specifically to bring in these sorts of considerations and to raise the idea of losing eligibility or default or other things. Some people consider this a bug of the current system, and some people consider this a feature of the current system. So, Peter, with that, if you could maybe bring the intentional design of this along with the economic objectivity in your response, that would be very interesting. If not, I'll ask you about it in the next round.
Thank you. Works? No, it does. Well, now it works. It is. It's an important topic. So thank you, Athanasios, because you have pushing this topic since many years. You came in my office very often to discuss that, and I was always listening. I think it's an important topic, and things have evolved very much since the global financial crisis, and you mentioned some of the... So I think there is a break there which drew the attention to the problem. That's my first comment. I always remember that I speak for myself, but I was personally happy sometimes to have DBRS, which was more lenient than the other 3 rating agencies, because I thought if that one changes, then we are not really prepared for that sort of situation. So I was looking at the softest of the 4 rating agencies, and that means that there is a problem there, because we were in the system, but at the same time we were not ready for the situation where the cliff would happen. Because when the things were designed and used the rating agencies, and communicated in 2005, Jean-Claude Trichet said, we did it before, we practiced before, but it was not announced. So this clarification on the use of external ratings was for me and for Athanasios a regime change. And at that time, the ECB did not clarify what would be the conditions under which they would not follow, the ratings, including, of course, the cliff, because that's the main important fact. So it's an important topic. It's politically loaded. That's what you say. You can put it in many, many dimensions. It's politically loaded. I will explain that a little bit. The point of Francesco, I would disagree actually with what you say. Sovereign debt is a key asset. Athanasios said it. So even, and we may discuss that, of course, even if the banks don't use government bond as a primary source for collateral, it influences the whole financial ecosystem. How the ECB treats government bonds, not only in the collateral framework, but in the asset purchases, of course, influence the whole general equilibrium. And of course, as a consequence, the banks. You know that the ratings of private bonds cannot be higher, with some exceptions, of course, if they are really highly collateralized and all that, but it cannot be higher than the sovereign debt rating. So indirectly, in any case, even if banks do not use, a lot of government bonds, they will be affected very much. And we talk about the global ecosystem. So I think the title of this seminar could have been broadened to not only the collateral framework, but also, what is related to the asset. You said it, but and rightly. When I try to summarize in my mind in very, very simple sequencing, I would say, yes, it's a key asset, government bonds. So we have to recognize all the pricing of private, lending private bonds is based on this. So you have to be extremely careful about what you do about this. The second thing is that, and a little bit Francesco, we are not in a fiscal union. So it is true that this is unique, but the monetary union is also unique. We don't have a fiscal union. And so I think this naive idea that market discipline would be very important, and the ECB should encourage market discipline by taking external rating as one of the elements of market discipline. I think we learned in the global financial crisis that can be very, very dangerous to do, and maybe not a very good idea to rely on this. Now, of course, there were options to deviate from that, but they were not clarified actually ex ante. They were clarified much later, of course. So no fiscal union, and relying on market discipline, and market discipline, one element, not the only one, but market discipline, external rating would play an important role in that sort of naive pre-global financial crisis view of the world. The third one, which I found quite interesting in a PhD from a Klooster, Jens van het Klooster, is that in the fiscal framework that we have is very weak. I mean, that's not the least. And in this PhD, there is a reference to the opinion of the Buba when the SGP was agreed that, and I quote from this PhD thesis, public issuers don't need to be rated because the SGP ensures a sufficient degree of creditworthiness. I didn't check, Ivo Masio, an historian, but that's interesting to check. I guess it's true. But there's this view that the SGP would make, external ratings irrelevant because you have a... now, of course, the SGP was not followed, of course, in 2003. You remember what happened with France and Germany. And so, again, we're not prepared to that sort of situation. And that was before the global financial crisis, of course. So the fourth point then, so the fiscal framework is weak. That was contrary to the expectation when the SGP came in place. So we say we don't really need the ratings, but we have a fiscal framework. So you just don't want to discuss too much about this. And then you get the last point, which of course is what Francesco reminded us, is Article 124. There's no privileged, finance, no privileged access from government. And what does that really mean? Because it means same treatment as a private. And I would agree with Athanasios. There is an element of circularity, of course, here, because you would say no privileged treatment, but the way you treat this key asset, government bonds, will of course influence the market prices. And the market prices will influence, of course, the way you consider government bonds. So there is an important point that Athanasios was saying is that the communication of the central bank, how it treats in difficult times, government bonds is key in the whole ecosystem, of course. And I think This is really something which evolved very much. In the beginning, it was say we don't want to do politics, so we rely on external ratings because we think market discipline will work, which we learned it the hard way. But with the crisis, the ECB started to come with first conditional liquidity support. Francesco, I remember that's how I met you the first time, was the S&P. Every morning you came, about recommendations, what happens in the market, how much can we spend today, and what sort of markets should we target. That was, if I may say, improvisation without a framework. It was basically to say we recognize that government bonds are very important, that markets can overshoot, that they may multiple equilibria, and so we come in. And then there were these letters. You remember the letter of Mario Draghi and Jean-Claude Trichet? I remember I just entered the central bank at that time to Berlusconi in Italy. And if you read what is in the letter, it's very strong because it's very political. You say you should do this, not in macro terms, but in micro terms about what you should do, in terms of efficiency of the public administration. I have the quotes here in my notes if needed. So the ECB has been led, by events to say, okay, fine, we have a sort of framework which is based on market discipline, which in which rating agencies will play a very important role. But there are options which were not clarified before to deviate from that in some circumstances. And then you got the S&P, but then immediately you put some vague conditionality in the letters you wrote. There are other examples. I remember also, I will not be too specific because this is a little bit confidential, but I think it's very interesting to look at the waivers, the rating waivers on Greece. Then there is elections, there is a change, and then the waivers are lifted, and then they come back later on. I mean, so I think the ECB has been pushed. I will give you, not to be too long, that the argument in the beginning was that market-based, and we want to protect our balance sheet. This is an essential. The protection of the balance sheet is not a main objective of the central bank, because you may take, for price stability reasons, risks on your balance sheet. And we do that, I mean, with QE, of course, but also with, the PEP, and so that's one of the things. The balance sheet protection is an important element. The no privilege access, you have to keep that also because it's in the treaty. So you have to specify the conditions under which you may do things, which, looks a bit unorthodox. But unavoidably, and that maybe, Athanasios, you may diverge with me, unavoidably, you are in politics. And so I always consider the review of the fiscal framework, all the discussions are of key importance, of course, for the central bank. But as I say, protecting the balance sheet, sometimes for price stability reasons, you do things, for price stability reasons, and that may expose your balance sheet as we see today. In some circumstances, QE, for example, before when it was really activated, basically the criticism was that it was leading to fiscal indiscipline. So in other circumstances, QT may play in the other way if you do QT now. So that would reinforce perhaps the pressure on governments to do. So it is a very complicated sort of environment. It is clear that if we had a very strong fiscal framework, then the situation would be very different, but we don't have that today. I just give you a final quote, to give time for the discussion. First is the quote from Isabel Schnabel in May, when the TPI, I think it's, when the TPI was decided. As you know, the TPI basically says that the central bank will ensure the smooth transmission of monetary policy in all jurisdictions, which in my time was something I would never dare saying, in all jurisdictions, because that was the idea that, these things, you better be careful about that. Again, because markets may be right. And then you say there are fundamentals and non-fundamentals, which is very difficult to distinguish. And Isabel says it's probably fair to say that such a steep hiking cycle, this rate cycle, would not have been possible in the absence of the TPI. In that sense, the new tool to ensure smooth transition was a precondition for tackling the inflation problem forcefully and preventing a de-anchoring of inflation expectations, which is very interesting because you say, had we have this sort of liquidity backstop, basically relying on 4 criteria, which is very difficult, which rating agencies, by the way, are not mentioned at all. But we are ready to do that. And if were not able to do that, we would not have been able to have this hiking, cycle as we did. It's quite interesting. So that means that the discussions that we have now on the fiscal framework and all that is absolutely of key importance. And it doesn't augur well, of course, when you see the difficulties of, coming with an outcome, of course, of that. So I think it's a very important topic, and I thought the 2 introductions were extremely good and interesting.
We have about 15 minutes left for discussion. The through line in all of your different opinions seems to be that sometimes the ECB can be pro-cyclical. And the question is this the best we can do, or can we do better? Athanasios, I would ask you, this collateral framework right now, this review, is happening at the same time that the euro area is also looking at adding risk weighting for sovereign bonds on bank balance sheets. It's happening after collective action clauses were sort of built into the system. So how do you square this, to my mind, very understandable desire to protect financial stability by taking away something that has clearly contributed to financial instability, at the same time as there's appetite to add more consideration of differences between bonds, at least on paper, rather than less?
I wouldn't want to bring everything into the discussion. I would go to the beginning of your question where you asked, is the current framework the best we can do? I'm going to stop on that and then ask the question, like listening to Francesco, for example, I didn't hear any arguments justifying why credit ratings should be determining the eligibility of government debt. I think we should start with simple things. As Peter said, when the framework was put together, I mean, this is a fact. This is, maybe you can tell us more about this, Francesco, but I don't think people inside the ECB recognized that just this decision on the plumbing to delegate the collateral eligibility of government debt to rating agencies could cause crisis. I don't think this was recognized as a risk that would be noticeable at all. It was considered such a remote possibility that it was not discussed. Now, of course, the ECB is incredibly secretive, so we don't have the memos that were written at the time.
Can I just say having 3 former ECB people up here talking about how secretive the ECB is pretty funny, but go on.
Well, but no, the ECB, I mean, look, I started my career as a Federal Reserve staffer, so for the Fed, if a decision was taken 10 years ago, I can go and find the memo that was produced and discussed at the FOMC, so we could have more reasonable discussions and justifications. So the question is, I'm not sure if there was a good justification on an economic basis for saying, yes, we should be using credit ratings for government debt at the time. I did not hear any objections from Francesco on this. So we'll start from that very, very simple thing. My answer to the question is none. There should be no role for credit ratings in the collateral eligibility of government debt.
What about risk weightings?
Because this actually affects many other things. Then I'm gonna actually go as Peter said, the collateral framework, and this is something that was well known, is designed in order to ensure the smooth transmission of monetary policy. And yes, it is a consideration to protect the balance sheet of the central bank. And this is why we have typically small haircuts on marketable securities. And there isn't anything wrong having small haircuts on marketable securities. That cannot justify the cliff effect, which effectively is hardwired right now in the system. So I don't want to bring the other considerations. I want to actually comment on the fact that The original idea was, can we protect the ECB as an independent institution from politics? And the original narrative was, well, the more market-based we are, the better we will be able to protect the ECB from politics. Unfortunately, that's true and false. It's
Right.
true if you have an implementation of framework that makes sure that markets converge to the better of multiple equilibria in government bond markets. Unfortunately, in government bond markets, we have many reasons why we may have multiple equilibria. And unfortunately, the plumbing, the implementation of monetary policy, the way it was done, did not ensure that markets would be guided to the best of the available sustainable equilibria. And what the result has been since the global financial crisis is that the ECB has become extremely political, which is something is not new. This was actually discussed in 2005 when the framework was under discussion. I recall Otmar Issing had a speech discussing proposals that the ECB's collateral framework should be used even more openly for disciplining governments. And in his view, he pointed out that would be a bad idea, because if the ECB were to do that, that would politicize the institution, and nobody wants to have a political central bank.
And there is a
in the
through
US.
line there for your thoughts, because on the one hand, more transparency is good. On the other hand, every time the euro area has closely defined a financial stability tool, that tool has become impossible to use, and they've had to come up with a new one that is kind of magic. The current magic one is TPI. So how do we review this framework, on the one hand, to bring some of this stuff into the light, and on the other hand, to preserve the magic?
Well, let me mention that I fully agree with you that by having this vulnerability, the cliff effect linked to credit ratings, the ECB every few years has to face a crisis, and every few years has to come up with a new three-letter combination to do magic for a few weeks or a few months.
They come up with it, then they define it, it doesn't work, and they need a new one.
I don't think this is in the best interest of the euro area. Again, as a European citizen, I would like the ECB to do the best it can. In my view, once we identify one of the sources of vulnerability, and I think the reliance on credit ratings for government debt is one of the sources of vulnerability, we should remove it. And then we should explore what is the best way to organize the plumbing of the implementation of monetary policy without having credit ratings on government debt. And it's not an easy issue, and there would be, this is where I was hoping Francesco would give us a proposal on how to improve on the current framework,
about that, we've got
recognized
10 minutes left, and I'm going to split it between Francesco and Peter. And I would appreciate, Francesco, if you could come with your most practical ECB hat on to say, what, if anything, can we use this review to do? Because you all have outlined the arguments very well, and the question is there a way forward? Can we change anything in this review that would maybe help around the edges? And if you can try and do that in about 5 minutes, and then Peter, if you could maybe sum up and talk about, as you did so ably, some of the political considerations that go into this.
What I'm trying to do here is to distinguish two different sentences, one with which I fully agree and the other one with which I fully disagree. The one I fully agree is government bonds are important. Yes, they are the linchpin of the entire financial system. The one with which I disagree is the collateral framework of the ECB is a cause of the crisis. This is just not true, because the effect is much too small. And of course, I mean, what the ECB does with outright operations is very important. But outright operations are fundamentally different from temporary operations. The power of outright operations, you buy and you keep it on your balance sheet, is very different from you take it as a guarantee for your lending. So I would like to make these 2 points extremely clear. There is no way that I'm saying government bonds are not important. They are very important. And of course, what the ECB did with QE just shows that, I mean, if you look at the composition of QE, The bulk of it is government securities, and very small is non-government. If you take collateral, it's the opposite. The bulk of it is non-government, and the very small is government.
Use the collateral framework as a credibility measure. I mean, we see that with the EU debt, which has just gotten boosted into the #1 category. I mean, it's an important market signal, even if it's not used as much as you say.
Yeah. I'm not saying that this is irrelevant. I'm just saying you cannot say that this is the cause of the crisis. I mean, if you want to look at the cause of the crisis, look somewhere else. Now, your question, what could be done better? I see there are two things that definitely would not be better. One is, which is the only way I think is consistent with Athanasio's conclusion. The ECB goes out and says, we don't care. We take government bonds, whatever happens. Whatever you do with your public finance, we will take it in all circumstances with zero haircut. No, I don't like that. I don't think this is possible legally. I don't think this is a good idea from an economic point of view. The other one that I don't think is good is, no, the ECB will decide. The ECB will decide whether this is acceptable or not, depending on its judgment. And I think that this would be even worse because it would put all the burden on the ECB. What is there to be found? Okay, I mean the ECB is going to have a review of the collateral framework. We will know sometime in March what will they come up with. Here at Bruegel, we are thinking of advancing the thinking by doing our own review of the collateral framework. Maybe we come up with a new idea. Very difficult to find something that is better. And I quoted Churchill by saying democracy is the worst of all possible system except for everything else. So I would say the same for the collateral system of the ECB.
Yeah. It's very difficult, of course. I think the ECB cannot avoid, this politicization. I think it's impossible in the union. So whatever you do, it will be political. What they have now, and we have to think about that, is the use of external ratings with cliff effects, with an option not to follow. And then you can say, I get rid of the one and I clarify, and changed the model, and I say, like in the TPI, I may do this depending on what is fundamental, not fundamental, and then you go into politics because you go to the EDP, you go to macro, imbalances and plenty of things which are political. And at the end, you're still, you decide, even if all the rest is positive, you can still say no, which is, inherently political. So that's one option. So you keep what they do now. That's the direction. They keep the framework and they clarify just the options they have, or they get rid and they just go in a TPI sort of framework. I don't know if you have a better idea. So if you get rid of external ratings with options, because the options, we had not the options in the beginning. You remember on Greece, for example, the Greece remained, sub-investment grade. And the ECB decided that because, there was credibility in the program, they decided to waiver. That's extremely political, of course. And is that a good regime? And the rating aid, I remember also the OMT. I had a lot of discussions on the OMT, basically with the two, Moody's and S&P. I remember there were different views, Moody's and S&P, in the beginning. Moody's thought that the OMT was not good for sovereign ratings. S&P found, preliminary discussions that it was good because it was a framework. You see, there was a push for conditionality, and but at the same time, that was the other opinion. It could facilitate, of course, that restructuring. In the end, both rating agencies converged by saying the OMT basically is positive for debt sustainability, but that was not obvious. For example, I thought it very strange, these sort of discussions with rating agencies saying, we have an OMT framework, it should be good, for your ratings, because the framework is improved, it's not going to be chaos, and things like that. I found it very strange, this dialogue between a central bank and rating agencies at that time. I think probably, but that's very political. I agree with you, Athanasios. The TPI is very political. And it exists, today. So you cannot get out of this. So the only thing is look at the macro framework, the fiscal, not only fiscal, but the macro fiscal framework. And that's why Christine Lagarde, they continuously put a big paragraph on fiscal, the fiscal framework.
The ECB is trying to preserve financial stability in the name of keeping its monetary transmission and inflation fighting mandate going. That's where we start from all of this, right? The
And
ECB
price
has
stability.
one mandate, which is price stability, inflation fighting, and they justify financial stability as being essential for price stability. And so all of the rest of this is how do we keep financial stability going? And going forward, what I hope that people can take away from this is there's a difference of opinion on the best way to preserve financial stability. Do we make it all transparent, sort of the S&P approach of laying out all the conditions? Or do we take a Moody's practical approach and say, look, if you lay out all the conditions and it can't actually be used, that's not good either. Going forward into these reviews, we'll have to think about how that works. I think everyone has contributed to that conversation, and I hope we can continue it online and in writing, and maybe next time at Bruegel. Thanks, everyone. Thanks for joining us online.
Thanks.
Are we offline?